All right, and we're recording. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. Today, I'm joined by Tim Stainton, who is currently professor at the School of Social Work and director of the Canadian Institute for Inclusion and Citizenship. He is the author of numerous works on service and supports for people with intellectual disabilities, disability rights, individualized funding, history, ethics, and theory. I'm also joined by Keith Doe, who serves as the manager of organizational and spiritual life with Christian Horizons, a nonprofit charitable organization working with people with intellectual disabilities in Canada and around the world. He's also the author of the new book, Formed Together: Mystery, Narrative, and Virtue in Christian Caregiving. Thank you both for coming on the channel.
Thanks for having me.
And Tim, you're also, how I found out about you was through the paper that you published in BMC Medical Ethics, Disability, Vulnerability and Assisted Death, commentary on, I'm going to pronounce these wrong, Tuffrey, Wynn, Kerfs, Finley, and Hollins. And I recommend people check out that paper. It summarizes a lot of the issues right now that's happening. Did any of you want to expand upon yourself or your work for anybody that's new or not familiar with your work?
I'm good. I'm at the University of British Columbia, just to add that piece, but have been involved in various disability rights organizations around the country over the years.
Yeah, you're quite prominent in like when I look at because I follow a lot of disability rights organizations, and I notice your commentary as well, alongside Trudeau Lemains as well. Keith, did you want to talk about your work with disability? This is, I actually met you through I don't know if I would call it a debate, but a discussion on Christian morality and atheistic morality, and it was good to see that we both had a, well, you had a history with working with people with disability, and I had an interest in disability rights, so that's how we met.
Yeah, and if I think back on that conversation, it's one example of, I think, how those conversations can go really well. And I just really appreciated your thoughtful approach and level of humility in talking about the fact that we all wrestle through these questions of right and wrong, and religious identity and cultural identity, and all these different questions. And so yeah, that's a beautiful memory for me. And as I recall, I think we went to watch the Joker afterwards, which in itself is kind of a tour de force of some of these questions. So it's great to be here, and I've appreciated as well some of your recent discussions too, and the way that you've asked questions there. It's just come across as very humble, but also inquiring. And I know I'll speak a little bit to myself. So about 14 years ago, just over 14 years ago, I guess, I started with Christian Horizons. I had been training in philosophy, and I got my master's in philosophy from a small Catholic university here in Ottawa, Dominican University College. But there comes a point at which your ethical inquiry needs to mean something. And certainly through the writings of Soren Kierkegaard, that was one of his kind of main points, is that what's the good of believing these things and thinking these things and thinking this is true or not true if it's not going to make a difference in your actual life and circumstances. And so that, and together with the need for some form of employment, led me to Christian Horizons and working with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, something I never would have foreseen myself doing. But once you enter into that world and meet people who are part of it, it's really hard to go back. I've been there ever since. And just the way that being around people in all of their differences and all of their expressions and nuances can change who we are as people. And so I certainly, I guess I want to recognize off the bat that I don't come here as somebody who identifies as having a disability. And I know that there are such diverse viewpoints out there from people who actually experience this, who live with a disability. So I come more as someone who has studied a number of different ethical systems, certainly have concerns. I am from the Christian faith, and I'm really interested in these topics of conversation, and can also speak to my life being changed by encounters with people. I'm not the same person that I was 15 years ago, and I certainly have the impact of friendships and relationships with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to thank for that change.
Thanks, Keith. Yeah, I have a I have an interest in this particularly because through this narrative of uh, pro MAiD or anti MAiD or pro Bill C-7 or against, I've been seeing people from various backgrounds and also people with disabilities split on this. I don't know what the percentage of the numbers are, but this is why I feel like this conversation is important. And Tim, could you summarize what the overall narrative is against Bill C-7, particularly with the cases that you mentioned in your paper?
Sure. So obviously, Bill C-7 is a bill to amend C-14, and I think it needs to be stated that the disability community was also not supportive of Bill C-14, and that wasn't generally based, although obviously there was a diversity of opinion. It wasn't generally based on a blanket objection to assisted suicide or euthanasia in the kind of paradigmatic case that most Canadians think about. So someone in the later stages of cancer doesn't want to go through those last few weeks. That's never been the issue for the disability community, although I say there's a diversity of opinion there. The issue has always been that the risk this creates to a population that generally views the health system as highly ableist, and more critically, the social support system as woefully inadequate. So that was kind of C-14. The key protection for disabled people, although it was certainly not a blanket protection, was the reasonably foreseeable death criteria. So in other words, that would mean that if you simply live with a disability, you wouldn't qualify for MAiD because you needed to be, relatively at the end of life. And I think that was widely seen as the only significant protection for disabled people in C-14. So then there were two sets of cases. There was the Truchon-Gladue case in Quebec and the Lamb case in British Columbia, which was challenging the reasonably foreseeable clause as being unconstitutional and infringing on their autonomy rights to seek assisted suicides should they choose to do so. So the Truchon case in Quebec was the first to conclude, and the Lamb case was subsequently stayed. And in Truchon, there were a few concerning factors in terms of the judgment and from a disability perspective. Firstly, the single justice threw out two of the purposes of the legislation. So in the legislation, there's always purposes written in the preamble. And one of those was to prevent suicide, and the other was to protect the vulnerable. So she threw those out, saying they were principles, not purposes, which only left the access to suicide, reasonable access to assisted suicide principles in place. So that was concerning, and then did rule that indeed the current legislation, C-14, infringed the rights of, in this case, Truchon and Gladue, and struck down the reasonably foreseeable clause and gave the government 6 months to amend that. Now, that in itself was a problem, but it was not something that was necessarily insurmountable at that point, because the federal government isn't bound by a single provincial case, Judge. So if they had not done anything, things would have changed in Quebec, but not elsewhere. But more critically is they failed to appeal that decision to the Supreme Court, which would be the normal course of action on something that momentous. So they, for whatever reasons, they declined to appeal it. So put themselves in a position where they had to bring in legislation to remove the reasonably foreseeable clause. At least that's their view. That's, say, disputed in terms that it's a single provincial case. So that was very disappointing. And then, so C-7 comes along. It makes some minor adjustments in other areas, so provides for a short-term advance directive. So people that have been approved in the waiting period lose capacity. That's a whole other set of concerns that I won't go into right now. But the big one was the removal of the reasonably foreseeable clause. They, in order to, in their view, deal with the concerns that people might make a snap judgment, they brought in what they call a two-track system. So in C-14, there are 90 days. If you're not at the end of life, there's a 90-day waiting period. Physicians are required to look at your supports beyond your medical support, so your disability supports, etc., and advise you of the availability of those. But after 90 days, you would be eligible. So that is problematic in itself, because we know, for instance, that there's strong research that it takes about 2 years to adjust to a spinal cord injury. And during that phase, it's not uncommon for people to contemplate suicide. But we also know after the 2 years, people report generally equivalent or even better levels of quality of life than the general population. So 90 days is not anywhere close to sufficient. So that was bad enough in itself. So then the bill went to the Senate. The Senate introduced a number of amendments, despite hearing from, I think it was over 30 disability rights things, just people with disabilities, organizations, who all expressed very clearly that this act was a threat to disabled people, that it singled them out because disabled persons are the only group that's actually named in the acts, and basically infringed their charter rights by putting them in a position that no other Canadians are in by virtue of their equity designation. Despite hearing that, they also heard from, in the end, there was a total of 3 UN special rapporteurs that expressed their extreme concern about this legislation. The current special rapporteur for disability spoke to the Senate and the Senate committee and expressed those concerns quite strongly. Despite all of this, the Senate introduced several amendments, and the most controversial of which, and the one that the government ultimately accepted, was a sunset clause on the exclusion of mental illness, because C-7 originally had an explicit exclusion for mental illness, so they would not be included in the new eligible categories. So the Senate introduced an amendment that said within 2 years, people with mental illness as the sole underlying condition. So in other words, these aren't people who necessarily have another life-threatening illness, but have intractable mental illness, as they refer to it, that they will be eligible within 2 years. In the meantime, we're going to study it, which is if there was ever a cart before the horse scenario, this is it. And that, when it's gone back to the House where it is now, the House, the government accepted that amendment, despite the fact that in C-14, they had committed to rigorous study and review of that issue, along with advanced directives and mature minors. They'd commissioned the Council of Canadian Academy panels to review those. So basically, by accepting that amendment, they've contradicted their own plan and said, right, we'll accept first and study later. So sorry, that's kind of a long answer, but I hope that gives a kind of pocket review of what went on. I don't know, Mark, if you want me to go through the objections now, or we want to chat about that a bit first.
Keith, did you have any commentary on that?
It sounds like a pretty thorough description, and you've done a good job, Tim, to describe it. And certainly, his level of understanding of what's led us to this point goes further than mine. So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I'd like to go into the objections specifically about your view about the foreseeable death part. So is this something that you are against or in favor of? Like, do you think the court was correct in this?
Oh no, absolutely. I think abandoning the reasonably foreseeable death made a dangerous piece of legislation much more dangerous. As I argued in some of my writings, the reasonably foreseeable criteria was the only safeguard of any significance remaining. Because we know that consent is problematic. So we know from evidence from the Netherlands that people with autism, intellectual disabilities have been euthanized, and concerns have been raised about coercion and how free and informed their consent was. But the biggest issue for us here at the moment is around that consent issue. So what proponents will say, oh, well, nobody's going to be forced. We're just giving them their autonomy rights and they can make a choice, a free and unfettered choice. Well, to have a choice, you need meaningful options. And what we know is that our disability support system, and particularly our mental health support system, is seriously deficient, that people don't get the supports that they need to live a quality life, that they're not able to access timely mental health supports. So what we're setting up is a situation where people will choose, they may feel they're suffering gravely. They may feel they have no hope, but the basis of that is that they have no hope because the system isn't going to provide them the supports they need to live the life they want to live. So they're not able to access appropriate home supports. They're not able to access appropriate transportation supports, so that they will choose assisted suicide over a life that's not worth living. But the question is, well, why is that life not worth living? And what disabled organizations are saying, it's because we're not supported to live the lives we want. And I think people say, well, that's just, alarmist stuff, but we've already seen multiple cases. That's right from the start. The Archie Roland case indicated he was choosing MAiD because he couldn't face life in an institution. Truchon himself, in the Truchon judgment, indicated through a spokesperson that it was life in an institution that he couldn't face. In many ways, the most tragic case was Sean Taggart on the island, who had a degenerative condition, was receiving home supports, and he was a single dad and wanted to spend his last years with with his son at home, but the health authority refused to provide him with the number of hours of home support he needed in order to remain in his house, uh, and was only offering essentially a nursing home, which would mean his ability to spend time with his son in their own environment and do the things they want to do were gone. And that for him was the key to his quality of life. And if that was taken away, yes, his life wasn't worth living in his view. Uh, in the end, I think it came down to 2 hours a week they wouldn't fund. Uh, and that was the cost of his life. And the last case that's been, sorry, maybe I'll stop there because that's the main objection. I think the other objection is around ableism in the healthcare system and people's experience, but maybe should we stop there for a minute and just deal with the first one, Mark?
Yeah, let's go ahead. There was also a case of someone recorded a session where they were being pressured to get MAiD or sign up for MAiD. Do you remember which case that was?
Yes, that was Roger Foley, and he is still going through a legal case. He recorded 2 incidences secretly of being pressured to accept MAiD because he had home supports. He had to go into the hospital, was there for a long time, over a year, I believe. And in simple terms, the hospital wanted the bed. They, essentially threatened him with charging him upwards of $1,800 a day if he stayed in the hospital. And he had to move out. And the community care people had offered him support, but they had offered him support from the same people that he indicated had abused him previously when they were providing his support. So he was very clear he wanted direct funding or individualized funding support, was more than willing to move out if he could be provided with self-directed supports. But that was not forthcoming. And of course, the community care agency and the hospital and health authority are separate entities with separate budgets. So the health authority, concerned about their budget, wanted them out, and community care folks weren't that concerned about the other budget. So clearly, one of the solutions the health authority came up with was to offer him MAiD, and say it happened not once but twice that he's recorded, and those are publicly available. So again, these aren't theoretical fears. These are things that are happening and have happened.
Yeah. Keith, did you have anything you want to, any commentary on the objection to the foreseeable death clause?
Well, I mean, I think most of it revolves around that or issues related to that in one way or another. And there are so many big questions at stake here in terms of like how is this being approached from an ethical framework? Which lives matter? Like whose lives are valuable? I think of, and I think you've read some Judith Butler as well, Mark, but in her Force of Nonviolence book, I'm really struck by the phrase grievability, right? So whose lives are grievable, and how does that impact all of our systems and structures and the expendability of some people over another? And obviously it's not phrased in that way, but there has to be certain societal influences at play that make it possible for, because we've kind of moved from medical assistance in dying to more of an assisted suicide situation, right? If you remove the reasonably foreseeable clause. So there has to be some plausibility framework. There has to be some framework that we're in that makes it make sense that people with disabilities can take their own lives and others aren't allowed to, right? And whether or not you agree with MAiD in general is kind of besides the point in this scenario, because you're saying there are certain people whose suffering is such that they should be able to take their own lives. and we know that there are so many complicated forces at play there that that most people see the lives of those with disabilities as less worth living than people with disabilities themselves. It's been called the disability paradox. I don't know, maybe Tim can explain to me why it's a paradox. I think it's just a mistake, an error that that sometimes those societal fears about what would it be like to live with a disability can all play into the perception of people's lives. There's recent work done with doctors, for instance, that 82% saw that their patients with disabilities had worse quality of life than those who didn't. And so the response in those scenarios, and especially if we think of other cases where people might be marginalized or not have access to the supports and services that they need, the answer is typically not to say, well, let's offer them death, right? It's typically to say, okay, well, yes, we've messed up, right? What can we do to help that quality of life improve? And that's the force or the direction. And it becomes so complicated to say, again, to start weighing some people's suffering over other people's suffering, even if it is physical suffering. And I think in the last, I think it was the last conversation you had with Udo and Sandra, they were saying that it's often, especially in modern medicine with so many uh, medical advances, that it's often fear of pain rather than pain itself that will drive some of these conversations, right? So you have to ask, why is this suffering kind of weighted as differently than other folks who are suffering, and why do we have a different solution in mind for these folks?
So how do you both comment on when people say it is about my choice, even with supports, if I did have supports, or I currently do have supports, but I'm in excruciating pain and it's not foreseeable that this is going to end, and my death is not foreseeable, what happens to those people?
I I mean, I think the debate's kind of got a bit turned around. Well, that's the way we've always lived our life for millennia, right? I mean, we talk about it as if this is somehow new, right? um, and and I'm not minimizing their suffering, but as the Supreme Court said, and the original C-14 legislation said, this has always been about balancing autonomy against risk to the vulnerable, right? That's the core principles that are being debated and always have been debated. I mean, that was why in Rodriguez, the court ruled the opposite ways. They said the risk to the vulnerable by respecting this aspect of people's autonomy rights is too great. The Carter case, they switched the equation, but still recognized that protection of the vulnerable was a key and important principle in this, as C-14 did. So yeah, I don't want to minimize the suffering of those folks, but the question is the risk to others. And if you think about the consequence, so yes, some people, a relatively small number, might be asked to continue living in a way they feel is untenable for them, or their suffering is so great. I should point out, as you mentioned before, that most people don't seek assisted suicide because of pain. We know from Oregon data and other places, it's a loss of dignity, which is how they characterize needing personal supports, or feeling they're a burden to others. We can manage, the palliative care folks will tell you, we can now manage the vast majority of physical pain. So that's a bit of a red herring. and not to minimize those that do experience that. But the question comes back to allowing that small group a right to terminate their life, justify risking the lives of people who don't want to end their life. They simply want a life of dignity, and they want the supports to live a good life. Uh, and historically in law, you always lean towards the protection of life, not just in law, in ethics, in religion. That's kind of a core principle. So really the question comes, well, how many unwanted deaths are we willing to tolerate to allow some folks who may well be suffering to pursue that? And that's what it really comes down to. And one of the ironies I find about debating C-7 right now is with the COVID pandemic, it's exactly the same principle, right? We're saying, yes, we know it's hard for you to have to wear a mask, to not be able to go out, to not go to school, to not be able to run your business. But because of the risk of giving you the freedom to make those choices, to not wear a mask, to open your business, to gather in large groups, the risk to others is such that it balances against your autonomy rights. And so in theory and in principle, that's exactly what the MAiD debate's about. And yet everyone seems to be, not everyone obviously, but the majority of the population seem to accept the limits on their autonomy in the COVID situation, but doesn't even recognize the risk to disabled people in the MAiD debate.
Yeah. Actually, could we move on to ableism within the medical field and how that permeates within the system, and also the view of disabled lives, how we one define disabled, and then also how we view them in terms of value and how that affects society and society pressure on an individual. So I'd like to go on the first one in particular. Keith, would you be able to expect, because you wrote on my social media about how the conversation about ableism was a surface level from the last conversation I had with Udo. So I was curious if you could expand on that.
Right. Yeah, I'm just trying to recall that that discussion, but I think it's more the framework seems to be quite surface level when you think of the research that's gone into disability studies and hearing from people who live with disabilities that Udo did a good job, as Tim has done, of framing what brought us to this point and some of the key concerns. There was one point at which, though, he was talking about ethical values that are driving the judgment. And he was saying that really there's only one ethical value that matters. I think I have it here. Respect for individual autonomy and the self-regarding choices such individuals make vis-a-vis their end of life. And he goes on to say what doesn't matter. So what doesn't count is other people's opinions. For instance, family members, or it would include medical practitioners. And that to me is where we seem to strike a really kind of surface level understanding of how we make decisions in community and how much we depend on community and how much our quality of life depends as social creatures on the interrelationality, right? The interdependence of us all. That certainly there would be a form of modern thought that would think of the individual as atomistic, right? That the rugged individual who can go through life and make their decisions in isolation. And but I think for the most part, we've recognized that that's just quite simplistic. And for all of us, those relationships that form us. And you mentioned my book that came out, actually arrived in the mail today. So I'm going to hold it up here because it's the first chance I have to do so. So it's called Formed Together, Mystery, Narrative, and Virtue in Christian Caregiving. But one of the main premises of that book, and I do draw on Judith Butler along with the Christian tradition, is to say that we are all formed in community, whoever I am, whatever choices I make. And yeah, a lot of my work has been with people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And you can see that sometimes in a really raw way, how people are open to the power of suggestion, how people are open to the expertise of medical professionals, maybe without stopping to question, without stopping to really inquire into that. But I think it applies to all of us. And that's the argument that I make, is that none of us is as rational or as pragmatic or whatever logical, whatever word you want to ascribe to it. None of us makes these decisions in a rational vacuum. And there are tons of books out there on cognitive science that that prove that, right? And so we have to ask, what are the forces at play in these types of decisions? What are the forces that lead someone to a place where their suffering is unbearable? And certainly, so having protections in there for people whose intellectual capacity might not be such that they can fully comprehend the weight of their decisions is crucial. But at the same time, show me one person who understands everything that's going on and has the complete foresight to be able to know kind of how things are going to end up, or what supports they might be able to achieve, or what their life could be like if given the right supports. And then tie into that some of the misconceptions that can happen, or the misunderstandings or misconnections that can happen, even with the people who are closest to us in our lives, right? Where seeing myself as a burden can happen with the glance of an eye, or a statement taken out of context. I can suddenly perceive that, oh, maybe this person isn't as happy to have me here as I once thought they were. And this happens all the time, and it's usually a matter of working through that, and maybe coming to some really honest conversations that say, yeah, this is difficult, but it's worth it. In many cases, that will be kind of the result. I'm not saying that's always the result, but a lot of this is the stuff of human identity, and how do we push through some of the brambles and the difficult questions. You referenced the medical profession, and I certainly don't want to paint them out to be uh, a negative force. I mean, the medical profession has done so much for relieving suffering, for helping health outcomes, for all those different pieces. We do know that it is inequitable at certain levels for people in minorities and people with disabilities and other elements of intersectionality, that health outcomes and health support can be inequitable. Um, and then we know that to a certain extent, we're all impacted by ableism. We talked a bit about before about how the perception of disabled lives is often different from the perception of people living disabled lives. Again, not 100%, not all the time, but that's kind of the water we swim in. And so I mean, in our own work, we'll see people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, the question raised almost immediately, like, do they have a DNR on file? A question that might not come up as one of the first things presented to other people in our society. We saw with COVID-19 in the UK, instances where DNRs, and I haven't looked into kind of where this has landed, so I'll say allegedly there's DNRs are kind of written up for people in case they have poor outcomes from COVID-19, and not providing that final life-saving measure. We see in the prioritization of vaccines. I mean, I would say all over the place. And again, this isn't to make the medical profession out to be primarily a negative force, but if that's the way you think, if that's the water that we swim in, then that's going to have certain outcomes. And I think there's a reason as well. So we talked about, and I'll shut up pretty soon, but we talk about the different models of disability too, right? So there's a reason it's called the medical model of disability when your gaze is such that you are looking to fix the human person. Again, it can be a very positive thing to be wired that way, to be wired about how can I create health in this person. But when that comes to trying to fix part of somebody's identity, such as a disability or something that is not going to be fixed, right? That can create some harmful dynamics. And so the social model of disability has, I mean, the two need to be held in tension, but recognizes that disability itself is often a result of an inaccessible world, of communication barriers, of social stigma, of attitudes of people, and a lot of the disabling barriers that people face are things that could be remedied. Obviously, there's a lot of work that needs to go into that, and society needs to go through a change in order to make that a realistic possibility. But I think how we look at disability is in the background of all these conversations. So it's not as easy as just to say that people with disabilities can make this decision in an autonomous way and nobody else's perspective really influences that.
Yeah, we don't live in a vacuum to make those decisions, I don't think. Tim, do you have any commentary on ableism in the medical industry and as society, and how we view disabled lives and the individual as well?
Yeah, they're big questions, and we're going to run out of time. But I did want to just, before I do that, pick up on something Keith mentioned, that your previous guest had said autonomy is the only principle that matters. That is such an absurd statement to my view, and it's part of the problem here is that the MAiD activists have really pushed the autonomy at all costs. But it's a very, quite frankly, it's a very neoliberal construction of autonomy, which is very atomistic. It's very limited. And autonomy in political or ethical theory has never been a standalone virtue. It's always balanced by other principles. And even I always think of John Stuart Mill, one of the great advocates of liberty and a questionable utilitarian himself. He tells the story of a bridge crosser. And he talks about, so when is it permissible to interfere with someone's liberty? So he tells this parable of, well, if someone is walking along a bridge and is about to step off, is it permissible to stop them? And he says, yes, because their long-term autonomy, their broader autonomy will be completely terminated by that act, and they don't really want that. They're about to make a mistake, to fall off the bridge. And I think in this case, that's what we will see in the case of mental illness, in the case of a lot of disabled people. They're given no choice. And so all they see is the end of that bridge. And, we have every right to step in, and I think a moral obligation to step in and make sure that stepping off that bridge is the only solution to them leading the life they want to live and to their well-being. Anyway, that's a whole other story. Not a completely other story.
Appreciate that. Thank you. Yeah.
I think the question of ableism in healthcare is really complicated, and kind of, for me, two main pillars. Like, we know virtually every study that's looked at healthcare professionals' attitudes towards disability and disabled people has found the same thing, that they tend to have not only more negative attitudes towards disabled people than disabled people, but then the general public. And I think part of that is when you think about, well, their job is to cure, right? So if they can't cure a disabled person, they may go to a feeling of futility, right? And that term is a term that's used, medical futility, right? Because they can't fix them, they can't cure them. Whereas disabled people say, well, I don't need fixing. I'm okay, thanks very much. You can deal with my kidney stones and my tonsillitis, but as a disabled person, I don't need fixing. And that doesn't make my life less valuable. So we know from empirical studies around the attitudes, but we also, this has come up before, right? That it's not just in relation to MAiD. So the whole prenatal testing regime and the efforts that we go to identify fetuses with Down syndrome, spina bifida, and we know that roughly 90% of prospective parents will choose to abort that fetus on that basis. I've had 2 grad studies do students do theses just recently on the issue, and talking to parents that went through it, and they all said the same thing, that while nobody ever said to them, you have to abort this fetus, they all felt significant pressure from the healthcare system. Well, you can try again, you can have a healthy child. And so that's really the same issue, because it all boils down to the views of the quality and the value of disabled lives. We see it in neonatal euthanasia. So after folks who have, short-term terminal conditions, neonates have short-term terminal conditions, the most common group are neonates with spina bifida, which in the vast majority of cases is not terminal. So if you start to weave all these narratives together of neonatal euthanasia, prenatal testing, and medical assistance in dying, you see a common thread of a baseline view that disabled lives are not worth living. So in that kind of context, and again, Roger Foley's a really good example, in that kind of context, it's a very dangerous thing. And DNR orders, again, we've had many examples of that all over the world, of DNR orders, including here in BC. So we have an awful lot of reason to believe that the health system is not necessarily a safe place for disabled people. And I also have a son with an intellectual disability, so I spend a lot of time with other parents. And almost to a person, they will tell you that the hospital is one of the scariest places, because they know that there's always a risk that they won't get treated, or they will get triaged out, or the value. And let's say we had right early in MAiD, we had a doctor out east advising a mother in front of her daughter with an intellectual disability, cheerily saying, well, MAiD's legal now, So this isn't a fantasy of disabled people. This is within the disability community, it's a well-known fact that the health system is not necessarily a safe place. And say BC, we've just had 2 really disturbing reports around anti-Indigenous bias in the healthcare system. So they're not perfect. Like Keith, obviously we appreciate what they do, and they are, important parts of our health and safety net. But like everybody, they're not perfect, and the system isn't perfect. So that's one problem. But then there's a slightly deeper problem, which is in the ethical systems that get used in healthcare most commonly, which are generally a utilitarian approach. And the key principle of utilitarianism is greatest happiness for the greatest number. and that gets translated in bioethics, is we have a moral duty to prevent suffering. So you can find very well recognized, quite famous bioethicists who will say quite explicitly that it's actually morally wrong to bring a child with a disability into this world. Not just saying it's not necessarily a good thing. They're saying it's actually a moral harm. So when that gets translated into broader ethical decision-making in the healthcare system, again, it presents a very dangerous situation. And we've seen, many, many examples of that. Probably the most systematic is the use of something called quality adjusted life years, QALYs. And it's a system that was developed to help basically ethically triage people in medical systems. And just really quickly, because I know we're running out of time, but basically they do population-based surveys, and they ask questions like, would you prefer to live 10 years as you are or 20 years as a paraplegic? Not surprisingly, as they're asking the general population, most people say, oh, definitely 10 years like I am. So this gets kind of tossed around in a sort of pseudoscience salad and comes out. And then we apply that in healthcare decision making, right? So in essence, if you have one heart and you've got John, who's 25 but has Down syndrome, and Bill, who's 25 but is successful professional with the beautiful wife and the beautiful kids and the nice home in the suburbs, you then do the math. Oh, well, he's going to live this life, which we characterized as one of suffering, but the other guy's going to have this great life. So we're going to adjust the life years he will get from that heart. We're going to take some away from the chap with Down syndrome. We're going to add some to the other chap and come up with a seemingly fair and logical way to assign that heart. Right. And so that's the kind of principle you would get applied to triaging, whether it's the vaccines or treatment in hospitals, or the cost of medical care, right? As in the Foley case, really, should we be spending $1,800 a day to keep this guy in this bed when we got other people that could use that bed? So, and they have, and this is still a very strong school, I would say still the dominant medical ethics school, and has very explicit negative connotations for people with disabilities, and it's not hidden, it's written down. So sorry, that's a long answer, but I think between this sort of general attitudinal approach combined with an ethical rationale is a very dangerous cocktail.
Thank you, Tim. I appreciate your time and commentary on this. And yeah, we're reaching the top of the hour. So Keith, please stay behind. We'll talk about your book in another recording. But yeah, thank you both for coming on. And hopefully people that watch this will have a more holistic view about the conversation that's going on, and will make informed choices going forward about where they vote and who they talk to and stuff like that. So thanks again. I really appreciate that.
Okay, thanks for having us, Mark.
Thank you very much.
Very much.
Take care. Bye-bye.